According to an investigative story by the Federal, an Indian news site, they're reporting that just hours before Air India Flight 171 ever taxied out for its doomed departure, the same plane, a Boeing 787, had already sent up a warning flare. Early that very morning, June 12, the same Dreamliner that would become Air India Flight 171 later that afternoon arrived in Ahmedabad operating as Air India Flight 423 from Delhi. But as it came into land, the crew, as well as all passengers on board, reported a hard touchdown. Now, that in and of itself isn't the headline here, because the AAIB, India's aviation investigating body, briefly mentioned this incident in their preliminary report this summer. However, what the AAIB didn't say was just how bad and nearly catastrophic this incident was just hours before the very same Boeing 787 would crash on takeoff back on June 12. And that's the breaking news here. Not really the crime, but kind of the cover-up, so to speak. But the 787 Dreamliner, tail number Victor Tango Alpha November Bravo, didn't just make a rough landing that fateful morning, but a landing hard enough to trigger the aircraft's onboard fault logging systems. And according to the passengers, the problem started long before the terrifying landing. So much so that the pilot had to address the passengers. However, all he told them was that they were experiencing turbulence. However, what they were really experiencing was much more dangerous than turbulence. After the plane unloaded its passengers, when aircraft mechanics pulled up the log data on the events, one entry stood out. It read STAB POS XDCR, which told them that the stabilizer position transducer had faulted. It failed. And this isn't a cosmetic issue. This sensor tells the plane's computers exactly where the horizontal stabilizer is positioned, and it allows the Dreamliner's onboard fly-by-wire trim system computers to automatically adjust pitch, control, trim, and the aircraft's ability to hold the nose where it needs to be. Lose accuracy there and the entire flight logic control gets fuzzy. Lose it during takeoff and landing, and it could be a really bad day, especially if the crew isn't aware to manually rectify the situation. Earlier on June 12, 2025, the day of the tragic, fiery Air India crash, not only had the doomed 787 experienced a hard landing on its previous leg, according to the Federal, who had access to leaked Air India maintenance records, they report that there was a pattern of electrical and computer faults that appeared throughout the day on June 12. The first were seen during the hard landing of the first leg of the Dreamliner that day, operating as Flight 423, and later before takeoff on Flight 171 that crashed. It was also reported that at 1:23 p.m., 15 minutes before takeoff, Air India's 171's electrical faults began flashing. But according to this article, the Federal, it said it now has exclusive evidence that on the day of the crash, the 787 not only had a sensor issue in the tail, but its entire right side stabilizer motor was faulting and had to be replaced. Yeah, it was that bad. Once the plane taxied to the gate, the pilots made an entry in the pilot handbook about the stabilizer trim issue. And the AAIB, India's version of the NTSB, included a brief mention of this issue in its preliminary report, referring to the stabilizer issue, saying the crew of the previous Flight 423 had made a pilot defect report or PDR entry for status message STAB POS XDCR in the tech log. But that was basically all the regulator had to say about that issue, just brushing it off. However, as I mentioned, the passenger who wished to remain anonymous said on Flight 423, there was an announcement about 10 to 15 minutes before landing from the pilot, Captain Hardeep Deol. He said that we should expect some turbulence. But this article points out that the AAIB preliminary report failed to mention that the problem was more severe than they let on. The news site also said that it gained access to the Aircraft Health Management or AHM report that was sent to Boeing at 9:48 a.m. local time for Flight 423. That shows not only was the sensor showing stabilizer position malfunctioning, but also it was showing the electronic control box that drives one of the tail trim motors called the horizontal stabilizer, the ECMU or electric motor control unit. Both units were replaced the morning of the crash and the plane was released for its final and tragic flight. Of this incident, the AAIB report says the troubleshooting was carried out as per Boeing's FIM, or Fault Isolation Manual, by Air India's on-duty aircraft maintenance engineer, and the aircraft was released for flight at 6:40 UTC or 12:10 p.m. Indian Standard Time. Okay, so I know that was a lot to take in, so let's go over exactly how the 787 stabilizer system works for those that may not know, just briefly. And quite elementary, I might add, because I'm no aviation engineer. However, according to Boeing, the 787's stabilizer auto trim system, powered by fly-by-wire technology, automatically adjusts the horizontal stabilizer to maintain a stable pitch attitude, reducing pilot workload. The system has automatic functions like Mach trim to counteract Mach tuck as speed increases, and speed trim to maintain speed during engine thrust changes when the autopilot is off. When pilots make manual adjustments with the control column or trim switches, the system moves the entire horizontal stabilizer via a jack screw actuator to remove pressure, allowing the aircraft to hold its attitude. The system functions in a few different ways. One, it can make automatic adjustments. Sensors detect changes in the aircraft state, such as its speed or engine thrust, and the flight control computers command the stabilizer to move to maintain a desired attitude. Then there's Mach trim. As the aircraft approaches and exceeds Mach 0.615, the nose has a tendency to pitch down. Mach trim automatically adjusts the stabilizer to counter this Mach tuck effect and keep the aircraft level. Then there's the speed trim. When the autopilot is off and the engines are changing thrust, example during a go-around or a climb, speed trim adjusts the stabilizer to prevent the speed from changing dramatically, keeping the aircraft stable. And then there's the manual control. Pilots can manually trim the aircraft using switches on the control yoke or trim wheels. Also, when a pilot moves the yoke and applies force, they will typically use the trim switches to move the stabilizer, removing the control pressure. However, on the 787 and the A350, I believe, it moves the entire horizontal stabilizer, unlike some older aircraft with trim tabs on the elevators. This provides significant trimming authority across the entire speed range. The system also automatically trims when flaps are deployed or other configuration changes are made, maintaining the aircraft's trim speed without requiring pilot pitch input. For example, on the 787, deploying flaps can cause the nose to pitch down automatically to maintain the speed, a change that pilots of older jets would have had to make manually. Okay, so I hope I haven't confused you thoroughly, because there are more faults and issues with that doomed Dreamliner on that day. According to the Federal, before the stabilizer motor failed on June 12, there were more electrical faults plaguing the Dreamliner. The fire inerter, or nitrogen generation system, the NGS, had already faulted 2 days earlier. On June 10, 2025, the fire inerter, which helps prevent fuel tank fires, was also issuing a high-risk active fault alarm. The NGS works by continuously flooding the tail fuel tank's ullage, that's the empty space above the fuel, with nitrogen-rich air, displacing oxygen and thereby preventing the buildup of flammable vapors. But in aviation and on aircraft, active faults are referred to as Minimum Equipment List, or MELS, which is a list of specific equipment or systems that can be inoperative, but the aircraft can still fly if certain conditions or restrictions are followed. These are categorized from Cat A to Cat D, A being a fault with the highest risk that must be repaired within 24 hours, to D being the lowest that could be attended to anywhere between 120 and 160 days. And apparently there was still many more issues with the 787 that went on to finally become Air India 171, which of course crashed later that day. And this news site, The Federal, which I understand is quite respected in India, has a 4-part investigative series on the whole crash, so if you're looking for something to read, maybe hit the Google webs and search for The Federal. But I thought I would bring you the lead story from that series, especially if you weren't aware of the Dreamliner's hard landing that morning before. Because I gotta be honest, I haven't heard the story. Still, I don't think this is a Dreamliner problem as much as it is an Air India maintenance problem. And from what all we've heard this year, that seems to be a very big problem indeed. So what do you think? Will you be jetting off anytime soon on Air India? Please be sure and let me know down below.